Hello, I'm Jamal Khalili and this is The Life Scientific. The deal is I get to talk to some of the amazing men and women who are trying to understand our world and to make it a better place. And you get to find out what makes them get out of bed in the morning.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
We know more about ourselves than ever before. We're surrounded by data and information about everything we do. And if we analyse this data, it tells us something about who we are. My guest on The Life Scientific today is Hannah Fry, Professor in the Mathematics of Cities at University College London. After a brief spell working in Formula One, Hannah moved to the Centre for Advanced Spatial Analysis at UCL, where she looks for patterns in the data on human behaviour, studying everything from online dating to the civil unrest in London in 2011, and of course the COVID pandemic. She's also deeply involved with DeepMind, the AI research lab now owned by Google. Artificial intelligence, machine learning and complex algorithms are fundamentally changing the world in which we live, and we humans need to be aware of this. We need to think about what we want artificial intelligence to do for us. We should scrutinise the algorithms to make sure that their priorities are our priorities as a society. In the age of the algorithm, humans have never been more important, she says. Professor Hannah Fry, welcome to The Life Scientific.
Hi, Jim. Thank you very much for having me.
Now, Hannah, the rate at which artificial intelligence, machine learning and complex algorithms are changing our world right now is quite phenomenal, isn't it?
I mean, if you think about the progress that's happened in the last 10 years, I think it's pretty phenomenal. I mean, 10 years ago, we were struggling to use algorithms to recognise pictures of cats. And now we are having big discussions about how pervasive and invasive facial recognition technology is. You know, I think that how far we have come in such a short space of time is really remarkable.
And it does seem to me that you are trying to help us humans out. You're trying to open our eyes to what these algorithms are doing and improving our relationship with AI.
Yeah, I think so. And I think part of the reason for that is that I am genuinely optimistic about what technology can offer. I think that we're at a moment in history where the most important problems that we face, the greatest challenges that humanity faces, you know, climate change and food security and access to clean water and healthcare, you know, all of these are really fundamentally scientific challenges. And I think that where you have a new tool that can be used to understand the world better, as I really believe that we have with AI, you know, I think it's hard not to feel optimistic about that. But I also think that you can't just be blind to the negative aspects of this. I think you have to go into it with your eyes open. And while being sort of cognizant of the positives, the potential, also being very aware that these things aren't, you know, magic boxes, right? Like they're not these, you know, omniscient creatures that would just appear out of nowhere and can do absolutely everything, even though sometimes it's kind of how people treat them.
OK, Hannah Fry, more on that a little bit later on, but time for me now to take you back to your childhood, if I may. You grew up in Hertfordshire and went to school in Ware. Do you come from a mathsy family?
No, I think that's fair to say. Both my parents left school when they were quite young. No one in my family had sort of university education. You know, we were not a wealthy family. My dad worked in a factory that made hydraulic lifts for trucks, right? And my mum was a stay-at-home mum. I think it's probably fair to say, though, that despite not having an amazing education themselves, my parents, and especially my mum, just put so much emphasis on education as a means for, I don't know how to put it, like self-improvement, I guess, that it was the way to better yourself. It was the thing that you had to do.
Was she one of those mums that, you know, really, really made you knuckle down when you didn't want to?
Oh, yeah, Jim, honestly. So there would be times, right? There was one time in particular, which I remember, where I got something insane, like 94% in a maths exam. And I was skipping out the school gate, like running to her being like, look what I got. And she was like, oh, okay, good. So what did you get wrong? It was like her first response. Or actually, there was one other time. So I was in year 9, right? So I was like 14. And the school reports come out in summer, just before the summer break. And, did very well across the board. But in maths, I got a 1C, basically saying top of the class, but not trying very hard. And my mum was so furious with me. She basically didn't let me socialise for the entire summer holiday because it was just, as punishment, despite the fact that I still got a 1. So, yeah, I think it's fair to say she pushed me quite hard.
And so what about you now with your own children? I know you have 2 young daughters. Are you turning into your mum or have you gone the other way?
I think I might have gone the other way, I don't know. It's really hard. It's really hard to know what to do. I think what I'm really anxious about doing is I don't want to put them off, especially maths. I really don't want to put them off. And so I, at the moment, deliberately avoid doing sums with my daughter. She's only 4, right? So she's kind of like at the very beginning of it all.
Okay.
Because I think I'd like but I just want to create this image that maths is this playground, that it's this place where if you have the ideas, you can construct all kinds of realities and you can just, I don't know, go on a little voyage of discovery. And I think that is something that's a bit separate from the stuff you do in school. So for now, anyway, I think I'm going to try and keep those 2 separate.
Fair enough. So when did it first become obvious to you that maths was your thing? How old were you?
If I'm honest, I know that there's lots of mathematicians who are like, oh, I knew from aged 5 that I wanted to be a mathematician, and that was all it was. And I think for me, I didn't know I wanted to be a mathematician sort of until I was one. It's more like at every possible stage, I was like, I'm not quite done yet. I'm not ready to give it up yet. I actually, when I was doing my my GCSEs, what I really wanted to do after my GCSEs was either work in Formula One or be a hairdresser. And I had this conversation, I remember it so clearly with my mum, where I was like, okay, I'm thinking about my options. And she was like, okay, why don't you just do your A-levels and then we can revisit this idea. And then we had one more conversation during the A-levels and she was like, I think, maybe go on to do a degree. And by the time I finished my PhD, I think it was obvious that the hairdressing thing was not going to happen for me. Even though I still really love it a lot.
Never too late to change careers.
Never too late. I mean, I could pick it up as a sideline. I sort of love to, actually. But I think that for me, it wasn't so much that it was like, I wasn't born to be this mathematician. It's more like, the way I think of myself is that I'm just totally normal person who just happens to really like maths. Like it's more like I just didn't want to walk away from it at any point. I've never got to the point where I was like, I'm done, I don't want to see it anymore. And if you stitch enough of those together, I think you end up with a mathematician at the end.
Because sadly, I mean, for a lot of people, they may be good at maths, they may enjoy it, but then they'll have 1 or 2 bad experiences at school, and then they're put off the subject for life. And that's
totally.
It.
I totally agree. I always think that maths is like, I've really noticed when you talk to people who are not mathematicians, I've always noticed that they either say, oh, I really loved it, or I absolutely hated it. You never meet anyone, Jim. You never meet anyone who's just ambivalent about maths, right? No one's ever like, I can take it or leave it. They're always one extreme or the other.
So what exactly is it about maths that you enjoy? It's a big, maths is broad. It's not just numbers,
of course.
Right? So what is it that really fires you up? I
mean, in fact, it's almost never numbers.
Right.
I think for me, it's an experience that you can't describe fully in words. It's something that you will only know what I'm talking about if you've had the same experience. Andrew Wiles, the guy who solved Fermat's last theorem, he once described doing mathematics and particularly looking for a solution to Fermat's last theorem as though he was like travelling through hedgerow and, like going through bramble. And then suddenly he turned a corner and realised that actually he'd been exploring this perfectly manicured garden and everything was there perfectly in place. He just hadn't realised it. And I just think that's the best possible description of what it's like to do mathematics. You're not inventing stuff. You're not creating stuff. You are genuinely on this voyage of discovery in a world that has been constructed from logical ideas. And I just think there's something so remarkably beautiful about that.
I think a lot of people probably fail to appreciate just how uplifting. Even people talk about it being a spiritual experience doing mathematics.
Yeah.
It's the same in areas of physics as well.
Yeah, I mean, you must have the same thing, Jim, when you're playing with equations. I mean, you know what I'm talking about, right? Like seeing
Absolutely.
stuff that's already there. I think also the other thing about it being, almost a spiritual experience in part is because it's so frustrating. Like, I'm describing the glory, and the glory feels very sweet because there's so much pain, like so much pain along the way. And I think a very good friend of mine, Matt Parker, who's another mathematician, he always says that the key difference between people who are mathematicians and not mathematicians, it isn't that mathematicians find it easy. It's that mathematicians enjoy how hard it is. And
Right.
I love that idea because I think it's totally true. It's like the struggle is part of the process because it makes that moment of discovery, that turning the corner and realising you're in a manicured, perfectly beautiful garden, it makes it all the sweeter.
I mean, it's a bit masochistic, isn't it?
Yeah.
But a lot of people will recognise this, if you're doing a Sudoku puzzle or a crossword or a jigsaw puzzle. Again, you don't want it to be too easy.
No.
Part of the challenge is to push yourself.
Oh, it's the process, Jim. It's definitely the process.
Well, Hannah Fry, after your PhD, you realised, in fact, your dream of working in Formula One.
This is true. I've been obsessed with motorsport, for such a long time. I was very, this was the big thing, apart from being a hairdresser, that I really wanted to do. And I made it. I got there. I finished my PhD. I'd been sort of slowly inching towards it, I think, going to do maths and theoretical physics for my degree and then my master's. And then for my PhD, I ended up in fluid dynamics, which is the crossover between fluid dynamics and aerodynamics. I mean, they're very, very similar. And I landed this job as a junior aerodynamicist. And it was like the dream had come true. I've been working so long to get there. And then I got there and I hated it.
I mean, surely this is the dream job. You're putting together the mathematics that you did for your PhD, fluid dynamics, and you're working in F1.
I know. It was so disappointing. I think I'd wanted to do it for such a long time that I'd built up this idea in my mind of what it might be that was just not accurate. So I think I sort of thought, naively, it turns out, that there would be people standing around with like blackboards and like loads of equations on the wall. I think I sort of thought it was going to be Good Will Hunting, but with racing teams. I think that's basically what I thought. And I got there and it just wasn't that at all. I think what has happened is all of the really good stuff, all of the really juicy stuff, all of those equations that I loved so much had already been wrapped up in computer simulations 15 years earlier. I think there was a moment in time, I think, when it was how I had imagined it, but I was 15 years too young. And by the time I got there, really what you were doing was every day you would set up runs on your computer, and then the next morning you would come in and you would pick the picture that had the least amount of blue in it, which is, I mean, not that inspiring for me.
So
anyway.
that's the picture where sort of the mathematics predicts this is exactly the right shape.
Yeah, exactly.
For the car to go faster.
Exactly
right?
Exactly that. Yeah, and I just didn't want to. You know what it was, Jim, honestly? I just wasn't done with maths yet. And moving into that job would have meant that I wouldn't have had the chance to play with maths as much.
Right. So you stuck with it for a short period, but then you went back to academia with a job at University College London. So you'd done your PhD in fluid dynamics there, of course. But now, instead of working on aerodynamics of racing cars, you were trying to predict the behaviour of humans. You were working at this Centre for Advanced Spatial Analysis, which sounds a very intimidating sort of place by its name.
Just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it?
It does, doesn't it? I guess a lot of people want to know just what have the behaviour of Formula One cars and humans got in common.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like they're completely different, doesn't it? And in many ways, they absolutely are completely different. But the thing is that there are some techniques that you can port from one area into another. So in particular, if you had like a drone flying over, I don't know, like Wembley Stadium as people were funneling in and funneling out, the way that those crowds of people move actually has lots of similarities to the way that a fluid might flow. So you kind of have to imagine that you as an individual person are sort of behaving like a particle. But there are these similarities, if you think about like the pressure of a crowd, the pressure of a system, the way that things kind of navigate through a very small gap, through a series of doors. Actually, if you're kind of zoomed out enough, if you go far enough above the crowd, it doesn't mean that you can say, okay, this person, Jim, is going to pass through the gate at this exact second. You can't make those kind of predictions, but you can say quite general things about the volume of the crowd, about its movement, things that the equations are really capable of describing.
So basically, you analyse data on human behaviour and you're looking for patterns. And then you hope that these patterns might tell us something about ourselves that maybe we didn't know before.
Yeah, and I mean, they absolutely do. They absolutely do. So the London Underground is a really good example of this, of where the traffic flow system, the way that people are navigated around the stations, has been just dramatically improved, vastly improved by these kinds of techniques, by understanding where people are, how they're moving, and trying to optimise it using these sorts of mathematical techniques.
You also gave a now very popular TED Talk on the mathematics of love.
I did.
How to find a romantic love mathematically.
I'll be honest with you, Jim.
Is there a formula? Everyone wants to know.
This was sort of like a private joke that got terribly out of hand. that thought. So a couple of years after my PhD, maybe 4 or 5 years after my PhD, and I was invited to go and give a talk. And I was like, I mean, my area of research was not love, by the way, which you would well believe if you had any idea of my dating history, Jim. You would know that this is not my area of expertise. But I think the thing about it was I just get so frustrated when people think that maths is irrelevant and uninteresting and, hasn't got any application. Like, what's the point of this, right? Like, that's the thing that people always want to know. And I just see it as exactly the opposite. I think that you could literally give me any topic in the world and I would be able to tell you mathematical patterns that underpin it. And so the whole idea about this love stuff was I deliberately wanted to choose the subject that felt like it was furthest away from maths as possible, smash the two together and demonstrate that even in that case, maths still has something that it can offer.
Well, one subject probably less frivolous than this that you and your research group at UCL...
Nothing frivolous about love, come on.
Okay, something more sombre, more serious. You and your group at UCL studied this some years back, and that was the 2011 London riots. And the police strategy was criticised for being too slow to respond and being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Hundreds of riot police lined up, ready to spring in action in Oxford Circus. Meanwhile, all hell's breaking loose on Croydon High Street. You were working on a mathematical model of the riot that you hope could help to inform police strategy in the future. Yeah,
I mean, in theory, that was the big idea. This was a point in time where, it was the very beginning of using data to analyse human behaviour.
Of course, other scientists, including some we've had on this programme, who've studied riots, look at the psychology of crowd dynamics and human behaviour. You were saying you were just looking at patterns in the data. What made you think that it would be possible to predict the evolution of a riot in this way?
So predict is a really difficult word, right? Because I don't think I ever thought that you could say, okay, at 3:15, in Clapham Common, there's going to be a gathering, right? I don't think that you can do that. And I've never thought that you can do that. But I do think there are general things that you can say about the civil disorder that happened. People essentially were prepared to sort of stay local unless there was a very big gathering of people, at which point they were prepared to travel much further.
Well, the academic paper you wrote describing this mathematical model you created, the paper was boldly titled, "I Predict a Riot." Which is, yes, very bold. And not only that,
as I said,
published...
learn a lot of lessons on this project.
But it's a paper you published in Nature, one of the most prestigious science journals in the world, and was pretty well received in most academic circles. But when you presented your findings at a lecture in Berlin, my producer tells me it didn't go down so well.
I think that's probably fair to say. I think this is the reason why, in kind of it's such an important moment for me in my career, And I think what I really learned during this project with the riots in quite a abrupt way at that conference was that just how sorely unprepared mathematicians, computer scientists and physicists are for handling data around people. Because as you quite rightly put, I was standing on stage giving this sort of very optimistic presentation about this stuff, standing in Berlin, I should say, which is important, right? And the naivety of me to stand there in Berlin and speak positively about the fact that we were heading towards a world where an algorithm could help police to control an entire city's worth of people, right? If there's one city in the entire world, right, which is not going to sort of get behind that idea, it's probably going to be Berlin. And quite rightly, the Q&A was very harsh, the harshest I've ever had.
It just hadn't occurred to you that a mathematical model that helped the police in this way might not go down so well in a city with a long history for police intervention, police state.
I mean, when you put it like that, Tim, I look like an absolute idiot, don't I? I mean, I think in my defence, right, the stuff that we actually created was so crude that you could never have actually deployed it. I mean, it was very, very rough, right? It's very proof of concept. I did not create this weapon that could be unleashed on the world. But it was like I'd taken a first step towards something like that and hadn't realised the wider implications of it. I guess I'd recognised just how easy it is to clumsily bundle into a space without thinking of the repercussions of it. People always say this about physicists, don't they, Jim? I'm sure you have been accused, maybe not you, but you know these accusations,
Probably,
right?
yeah.
Of people spend decades thinking very carefully about these problems, and somebody who knows how to handle equations waltzes in and is like, I've got a solution for you, right? And I really felt in that moment that is exactly what had happened. That is what I had done. But I think that the reason why that was such an important moment in my career is that I think that then changed my the track that I was on, and I started working much more on thinking about that interface between humans and the algorithms that are created, and as you say, talking a great deal about both the positives and the potential side effects of fully embracing these types of systems. And the result of all of that was my book, Hello World.
This book, Hello World, is essentially all about how to be human in the age of algorithms and AI. It's a wake-up call to us all. But basically you're saying, look, do you realise just how many decisions are now being made by computer algorithms and AI?
Yeah, and I think that people sort of know, but it's definitely not at the forefront of people's minds. And I always think that, when drones first came in, right? I mean, if our skies were suddenly filled with drones, right, we'd be like, I don't want that for my future. I don't want to live in a world where these things are kind of buzzing around all over the place. But the invasion of our way of life is as dramatic as that, probably more so. But the only difference is that it's invisible. And so I think it's something that's much more insidious, really. It's something that's, I think, creeps up on us. We're like frogs in water that's slowly boiling, I think, sometimes.
I mean, it is difficult. I mean, we have to have the conversations about it, and we have to, people need to be aware of what's happening. But what about those people who work in the industry, in the tech industry? Don't they have a responsibility to be transparent about the downsides as well as the benefits of these algorithms they create? I mean, after all, they're the only people who know how they work.
Yeah, but then at the same time, Jim, I think that you can't expect companies to not act in their own best interests, and sometimes their best interest is being slightly quiet about the things that they're creating. And I think that it does really need slightly more top-down control.
Well, I know a few years ago you suggested that everyone working in the tech industry should take an ethical pledge, rather like the Hippocratic Oath for doctors. I wonder, have you ever said no to a piece of work on ethical grounds, or maybe challenge your colleagues directly about the possible undesirable uses to which their algorithms could be put?
That's such a good question. I've definitely seen lots of stuff that's made me raise my eyebrow. There's one in particular, actually. This is maybe 2018. I was at a conference in America, a policing conference, And there are all sorts of academics there, like criminologists and mathematicians and so on. And this guy who's like very high up in the police force came in to give a talk, and he was like, what I want from all of you, I want you to create me an algorithm that can tell me who is going to commit a crime next. I want you to tell me this person is going to commit a crime on this day, so I can go and knock on their door and stop them from doing it.
Isn't there Tom Cruise film about this?
Right? Right. It's like, I don't, no. Like, no. Yeah, so I've definitely heard lots of things like that. But however much you say, okay, academics should have this code of conduct, we should start teaching ethics to young mathematicians and computer scientists to make sure that some of the big mistakes of the past aren't made again. However much you do that, however much you ask technology companies to regulate themselves, it's like the old game theory thing, right? Like, you can't live in a world of purely altruistic people without simultaneously creating a massive advantage for somebody who's very selfish to come in and sort of take over. It's just... It's why you need regulation. I think that's really the big lesson.
Well, in recent years, I know you've been doing a lot of work for Google DeepMind, who do a lot of research on machine learning, and they're solving problems, hard science problems that humans aren't able to do, with their algorithms. A lot of people, it's obvious for people that something like sociology is loaded in, doing it, what sort of questions you're asking. But something like mathematics, you'd think it's value neutral, right? It doesn't matter who does the maths. Maths is the maths, the same equation you have to solve. But even here, the questions you ask, the way you ask them, what sort of answers you're looking for, even this isn't value neutral, is it?
No, definitely not. Absolutely not. I mean, I think I think the thing is about these systems that are being created. I think the thing you just said about maths being value neutral is definitely the way that people thought in like 2012, 2013. And then I think around the same time that I had that Berlin conference, people were really starting to realize that, hold on, what we're doing with this is we are creating a mathematical mirror that is like reflecting our society back to us. And the thing is that our society is not fair, right? It has incredible systemic biases riddled with them in every possible aspect. And what you're doing when you're creating this mirror to your society is you are just reflecting all of those problems right back at ourselves and expecting it to be neutral, expecting it to be this sort of mathematical arbiter of truth. And I think that there's a really strong argument that actually sometimes we really don't want our algorithms to be a mirror to our society. I think we want them to reflect a version of the future that we would like to live in rather than necessarily the one that we do.
I mean, people certainly worry that AI discriminates against certain groups of society, which it can. Do you think algorithms could be used to help us overcome things like unconscious bias? Worldview.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's really important to remember that this idea of like removing bias from something, it's not a finish line that you get to cross, right? You don't get to be like, okay, cool, bias done, like tick, rubber stamp it. But I think that you, if you think of it instead as like a system that you're continually trying to improve, then I think that's a sort of more positive way to look at it. So I think it's really important to remember that the human world is humans are a mess, right? We are a complete mess. So I think judges is a really good example of this. So if you go and look at judges who are really supposed to be sort of the arbiters of fairness in our society, there are all kinds of studies that show just how messy their decisions are. So if you take the same case and you take it to two different judges, often you get a completely different response. Maybe that's not particularly surprising. But there's studies that show that if you take the same case and you take it to the same judge, just on a slightly different day, you'll often get a completely different response. I mean, the mess it's several layers of mess. Like judges with daughters are much stricter in cases that involve violence against women. Judges don't like giving the same response too many times in a row. My favourite one of all, judges tend to be a lot stricter in towns where the local sports team has lost recently, which I think just kind of tells you the sort of level of mess.
They're just in a bad mood.
Just in a bad mood. I'm feeling a bit grumpy that day. And I think that what the algorithms can do, if you recognise what those human flaws are, I think what algorithms can do is give you the opportunity to minimize some of that inconsistency, some of that luck that is involved in that kind of system, some of the noise, really, isn't it?
And yet, you talk to a lot of people and they say, when it comes to issues like law or medicine, I would much rather a human decided than a machine with all our flaws. And yet AI, these algorithms can actually be more objective, and they don't have all these issues that a judge might have, or the downside of the human frailty.
Yeah, sure. But then at the same time, I think that it's wrong to think of it as though it's a choice between humans and machines. Actually, I think the best possible systems are ones where you are taking the things that humans find hard. It's difficult to search through slide after slide after slide after slide of tissue and highlight every single abnormality in that cell. That's just not something that humans are sort of built to be good at. But I think if you build technology to help with those things that humans find hard and then leave all of the stuff that humans are capable of doing much better than machines are, we're much better at understanding nuance, at much better at understanding context. I mean, we're much better at empathy as well, but I mean, that's a whole nother thing. I think it's really about creating the best possible partnership between humans and machines rather than thinking of one as a replacement for the other.
We've talked about whether we love or fear AI, or rather the technology that AI is used for. It strikes me that this is a bit like the way you were talking earlier about the way people seem to love or hate maths in general. Is what we're seeing here two sides of the same thing? That's
interesting. That's an interesting connection that I haven't thought of before. I mean, I definitely think it's true. I definitely think that we've got this real habit of either thinking that AI and algorithms is this amazing, magical thing that has all the answers. And then as soon as it's shown to be slightly flawed, we just throw it away.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I wonder if we've seen a similar sort of thing going on during the pandemic, with some people treating the mathematical models as if they were crystal balls delivering these perfect predictions of what's going to happen in the future, and then you get another group of people dismissing them out of hand because they've been created by nerds who have no understanding of the real world, when of course neither view is true.
I totally agree. I think that's an incredibly important point. But I think that when you talk to the people who really understand what these things can do, they will tell you that these are not crystal balls. They are not supposed to be crystal balls. And it's only in thinking of them as though they are making predictions of the future that really all the trouble starts. Everything kind of unravels when you imagine these things to be flawless. But what they can do is they can give us a better view of the future than we would have otherwise, right? They're the only tool that we have to help us look forwards in time. You have to take them with a giant pinch of salt. You have to recognise that this is an indication rather than a prediction. But I think that even then, they have this incredible value and power at being the only things that can take us forward to the future.
Well, Hannah Fry, it's ironic that someone like you, who clearly gets on very well with data, with coding, with modelling, should be leading the charge to get us all to realise how flawed these mathematical tools can be.
Do you think so? I don't know. Doesn't someone have to do it?
Well, someone has to do it, and you've stepped up.
Yeah, I do sometimes wonder. I mean, you've got to get the balance right, haven't you? I do sometimes wonder whether I do get the balance right, because what you don't want to do is you don't want to feed into this idea that they're not capable. But I don't know. I really think it's possible for two things to be true. I think it's possible for these things to fall short at capturing the full nuance of reality and still be the most powerful weapon we have to understand who we are and where we're going.
With the pandemic, despite its awfulness, it seems it has revealed the power of science and mathematics to improve our lives, and indeed the power of these models that are being developed, and the power of data to help us understand what's going on. Do you think it's made us all a little less fearful of numbers and data?
Well, I mean, we've looked at a lot of graphs, haven't we? It's certainly true that these topics of conversation have come up much more. I've had conversations in taxis, with cab drivers about mathematical models that were just, you never would have had those conversations in the past. You get mathematicians genuinely on the front pages of newspapers, which I think is like a mind-blowing idea. So I definitely think it's been more at the forefront of people's minds. Whether that's something that ends up staying, I don't know. I think that remains to be seen, really.
The other thing, of course, that the pandemic has revealed, I think, is just how different people's attitude to risk can be. The same statistic can mean wildly different things to different people, can't it?
Yeah, very true. I mean, I think if you look at, for example, the difference between how the UK handled case numbers and somewhere like New Zealand did, the same number was handled very, very differently, depending on the environment that people found themselves in.
And I believe you have your own personal experience of the way you perceive risk and how that's changed.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. Because earlier this year, I was diagnosed with cervical cancer. I was very much one of the lucky ones. The surgery was successful and, I am now healthy. But during the whole process, I mean, even now, there's a 1 in 10 chance that this cancer will come back. And if it does, you can't cure it. And the thing is I've handled numbers all my life, right? I've thought about statistics and probabilities all my life. And 1 in 10, 90%, I mean, it's like whatever. You can kind of forget about it. It's nothing. But there's a real difference when you are the person in the hot seat. There's a real difference when that number is about your future. Because all of a sudden, rather than it being 90% rounds up to 100, suddenly it feels like I'm in a lineup with 10 people and one person's going to get shot. And I think that both this and that Berlin conference have really grounded me in making sure that I am not flippant about numbers, making sure that I recognise the weight of these things and just how important it is to take all of these things into consideration when you're handling data around people. You can't think of people as though they're numbers. You can't think of people as though they're particles in a box without really understanding the far-reaching potential impact on the individual person. I think really that's what it's done for me is hammered home that point and pushed me further down the path that I was already thinking of things from.
And looking back on your life scientific today, I say this because you're still only 37. Do you think your
21,
career,
Jim? What are you talking about?
21. I do apologise. Do you think your career might have taken a different route if you hadn't got such a negative reception after that lecture in Berlin?
Ooh, that's such a good question.
It's difficult to predict how paths, whether you'd have taken a different path. But
I think I probably would have come to the same conclusion, but I think it might have just taken me a bit longer.
And what if your mum hadn't been on your case to work so hard when you were a girl? How much of a difference would that have made?
Oh, that's everything. I think that's absolutely everything. I think I don't think you can understate just how dramatic the impact that a parent who is really pushing for education as a kind of means to improve your life. I think that is so, so important. She sat with us every single day and just in a way that I don't have the patience for. I could never do with my children what she managed to do with us. It's really extraordinary, the kind of gift that she gave all of us to love learning, to be insatiably curious about the world around us, and just to not be frightened or intimidated of the amount of knowledge that is out there, but instead see it as this glorious adventure that you can go and participate in.
I noticed that you dedicated your book to your mum, Mari Fry, for never taking no for an answer. Am I to deduce from this that you've forgiven her for those days when you probably wanted to be out with your friends, when she made you sit down with those maths workbooks, even though you were coming regularly top of your class and probably didn't need all that work?
Forgiven her any day now, Jim. Any day now.
And presumably she doesn't tell you anymore that you have to try harder.
Are you joking me? All the time.
Really?
Yeah, she'll come around my house and I'll be doing some work and then I'll maybe nip downstairs for lunch and probably spend a little bit too long making a sandwich, and she'll be like, "What are you doing? Go back on and go do more work." Oh, she's relentless, this woman. Relentless.
Goodness me.
I'm a professor of maths, Mum. Come on.
Yeah, give it a rest. I've made it. Well, Hannah Fry, dare I say, the human face of mathematics, thank you very much for sharing your life scientific.
Oh, thank you for having me, Jim. It's been so much fun.
And thank you for listening. I'm Jim Al-Khalili. The producer is Anna Buckley. And if you've enjoyed listening and would like to hear more of my interviews with leading scientists, why not subscribe to the Life Scientific podcast? For nearly a decade now, I've been interviewing leading scientists, finding out how they got to know what they know, and revealing their passions and their quirks. It's been an incredible experience talking to so many remarkable people and learning about everything from black holes to bacteria, cloning sheep to coral reefs, fossils, Formula One, fracking, fungi, fruit flies. You get the idea. In fact, there are now more than 200 interviews available on the Life Scientific podcast, all there for you to enjoy. You can subscribe for free right now on BBC Sounds.